Hi, and welcome to the Goodpush Toolkit on child protection, which is one of the most important topics for any skate project that's working with kids. So this video presentation will look at what is child protection and how did the idea come about. Then we'll talk about trauma, what it is, what the causes are, and what are some trauma-informed best practices for skate programs. Then we'll talk about child protection policies and some related topics. Then we'll have a short kind of reflection activity on common risks for skate programs in terms of child protection. Then look at some best practices there and some ideas of next steps. So before we get into it, just think for a second about what comes to mind when you hear child protection. Have you heard this term before? Are you familiar with it? Is it the first time that you're hearing it? If it is the first time, maybe it sounds a bit technical, but it is simply about protecting the kids that you're working with. So where did the idea of child protection come about? Well, prior to the 19th century, in most of the world, children were not really seen as in need of any certain special protections or rights. They were often treated quite similar to adults. They were expected to work, and there wasn't things like universal education or anything like that. However, in the 19th century, in some countries around the world, this started to change, and there was the idea that children were actually in need of protection, and they should not be treated the same as adults. So examples were in Europe, laws were passed against child labor, or at least regulating child labor somewhat, and education was made mandatory for young children in certain countries. In the 20th century, the idea of children having rights grew a lot, and it became an international concept. So the legal rights movement really sped up. So starting with the First World War, there were some committees set up to protect children. Later on, there was different treaties on child rights. And after the Second World War, there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which had specific mention of childhood in there. And there's a few different things that happened in between. And then a big thing that happened was that in 1989, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly unanimously. So all the countries adopted it. 25 years after this, all of the member states of the UN have ratified this or signed off on it. The only exceptions are the US and Somalia. In terms of a definition of child protection, a group of non-governmental organizations came together in 2012, about 20 of them, and they wanted to create standards for child protection in terms of humanitarian interventions. And the definition that they came up with, which I think is a pretty good one, is the prevention of and response to abuse, neglect, exploitation, and violence against children. And when we're thinking about child protection, a really useful guiding principle to have in mind if you have situations come up at your project or whatever, is to always think, what are the best interests of the child? So we're talking about protecting children, and there are many different factors that can harm a child over their lifetime. And the concept of trauma, I think, is really relevant to talk about now, which is when a person sees or experiences a negative external event that overwhelms their capacity to cope. And trauma can happen anywhere in the world. Maybe we think when we hear the word about war or natural disasters, but yeah, it happens everywhere. For example, in the US, 60% of people have experienced some kind of childhood abuse, neglect, or other form of trauma. And here you'll see a list of kind of common causes of trauma. And maybe it's useful seeing this list to think about your own participants and which ones they may be facing. But yeah, in general, in any context, there will be a lot of these factors happening. It's useful when thinking about trauma or what the kids or young people that you're working with are facing to be aware of what local issues are. So especially if you're not from the context where your activities are happening, it's very useful to learn about what are the common issues that are facing kids. So to give some examples from Skateistan, we are working in Cambodia, and there is an issue of fake orphans where, for kind of monetary reasons, fake orphanages go to the villages and they convince parents to let them take their kids to the city and go into these orphanages, and then there's money being made by volunteers coming and playing with the kids or whatever, but it makes those children very vulnerable, and it's also not good for them to be separated from their families. Another example is in Afghanistan, where we work, child marriage is a really big thing. So even though there's laws that girls can't get married under the age of 15, it still happens a lot. Similarly, maybe it's not as well known, there is a lot of sexual abuse and trafficking of boys in Afghanistan. So they'll be kidnapped and trafficked. And yeah, this is something to be aware of in the population you're working with. And in South Africa, big factors in the communities where we work are HIV, very high levels of it, and also gender-based violence. So it could be useful for you to think about the community where you're working and what some examples of local issues might be that are facing children and young people. And the kind of work that we're doing with very vulnerable participants, it's really important to know the signs of trauma and be able to recognize these. So the effects of trauma can negatively impact a person's health and well-being way after the actual incident or incidents happen, and it can affect a person's ability to control their emotions or relate to others. And this is especially true when it happens in childhood, because trauma can delay or disrupt the normal brain development at a really crucial stage. So some examples of behavioral difficulties you might see would be impaired learning and social skills, low self-confidence, inability to control emotions, so getting really angry or really anxious, and modeling the behavior of abusers, so being very violent or perhaps acting kind of sexually inappropriate, especially for their age. Also, triggering can happen. So it's a stress response when something maybe reminds a child of a traumatic event. So particular people might be scary. They might remind them of someone else. Loud noises or voices can startle kids. There might be a fear of authority figures. So as teachers, we think, we're helping, and that's very clear. But to a child, they might find it scary if they've had bad experiences with teachers or other authority figures before. And also, if a child has gone through abandonment in some way of parents or caregivers, then having a high turnover of teachers at your skate project can be really damaging, because it's hard for them to build that attachment and to build that trust, and then to have these key people leave from their life. The flip side of that is that children who have gone through an adverse experience or a difficult experience can emerge feeling stronger and more resilient than before. And within our skate programs, we can try to encourage that resilience and help them to build the coping skills to deal with trauma. So many skateboarding programs are working with disadvantaged populations, often facing poverty, war, maybe displacement, these kinds of things. So if you are working with communities that have a high likelihood of having faced trauma, and even if you're not, I think that it's very useful to have a bit of trauma sensitivity in your skate program. So what does this mean? Well, the first thing is to be aware and prepared. So we've already started with that. You've learned a little bit about what trauma is, how it can appear in children that have gone through it. And so being prepared might mean having tools and activities for managing trauma symptoms. So if you're noticing low concentration or poor social skills, maybe doing some kind of skate games that will encourage children to be, engaged in connecting with one another. Then you can minimize triggers, especially if you have kids coming in new and they've never been there before. Maybe you think about trying to reduce the noise levels, maybe having fewer children at first, limiting physical contact, and you can also ask children for consent before holding their hand or helping them move their shoulders or stuff like that. Then it's also good to think about the location where you're doing your program. So public spaces can be a bigger risk because you might have just people watching that could firstly make the participants uncomfortable, but can also be potential risks actually to child protection. And individualizing learning means just recognizing that, people are going to learn to skateboard at their own pace. So be supportive and encouraging. And obviously, some kids are really going to want to be motivated all the time, but others might be more risk adverse and more careful, and accepting that and still encouraging them and being patient. Then having female-friendly skate programs can be really important, especially for participants that may have experienced gender-based violence. And similarly, having peer role models. So this is like young people, or at least people from the community that have experienced similar things, who can kind of show to the children that they've, overcome them, and it'll be something that the kids can relate to and will allow them to, really build attachment with these role models. You can also let the kids take control a little bit and give them a bit of autonomy by having them help with skate sessions, for example, distributing the skateboards or the safety gear, sweeping the skate park, leading warm-ups, or helping new students. This can really, help a child who's lost confidence or is unsure of themselves to build that self-confidence back up. Then you can also help kids to ground themselves. So, you can encourage mindfulness activities, breathing. I know there's quite a few skate projects that incorporate yoga or meditation before or after the skate session, which can be really cool. Obviously, yeah, with kids, you want them to release nervous energy. So just like trying to find ways to encourage that. Games can be really good. And okay, skateboarding is like not known for being the most structured activity, but when you're working with these kids that have faced a lot of trauma, a bit of structure can be really useful. That predictability that they know when they come, that there's a certain order of things, can really make them feel more comfortable. So it can just be like, how you set it up with like distributing the equipment, doing a warm up, maybe doing certain activities, whatever. But it's good useful thing. Skate projects also have a real opportunity to be a safe space for kids to share their feelings and ideas while they're just doing something that's fun. So we just gone from speaking about some of the external risks to children's safety in terms of trauma. And now we'll go into child protection policies, which are focused on how to make your own project a safe space. So what is a child protection policy? Well, this provides guidelines for an organization and their staff or volunteers to create a safe environment for kids. It's a tool that will protect both the kids and the staff by clearly outlining what action is required in order to keep children safe and to ensure that there's a consistency so that all the staff or volunteers are following the same processes. So at Skateistan, the responsibility of child protection is something that all our staff and volunteers share. We're all working to create a safe and tolerant environment. We work with kids from all different backgrounds, and we want them to come and feel like they're not going to be harmed or bullied in any way. So what does Skateistan child protection policy look like? Well, it's a written document that has all these procedures lined out, but it's not just something that sits on a shelf that no one ever looks at. It's really important that everybody on the team, whether volunteer or staff, understand, what to do in case of any different event, and also what to do to limit any risks of things happening. So staff get training, firstly when they're new and they first arrive, they get child protection training, and also there's an annual review on this training for all staff. Anyone that joins Skateistan also signs a pledge that states that they will be following certain principles for child protection. And on the reverse side, all the students that join Skateistan also sign a pledge, which makes them aware of their rights and what they can expect when they are part of Skateistan's programs. And we also just integrate child protection into all areas of what we're doing. So for example, when we make partnerships with maybe another school or another nonprofit, that partner will sign our child protection policy, and similarly, we will ensure that they have a child protection policy, and we will agree to theirs as well. It's really important for any skate project that's working with kids to have a child protection policy, and especially as you're growing bigger, you're going to need to have your guidelines and your things written down in a clear way so that everyone is on the same page. So some of the biggest risks to children's safety are actually adults that are in positions of trust. And so I'm just going to talk through a few of the kind of key points that we found at Skateistan that were important to have guidelines for. So firstly, we have visitor and media guidelines. So anyone that wants to come to visit a Skateistan skate school has to get in touch and arrange this in advance. If anyone just shows up, they are not allowed to come in. And we have a signed agreement. We have different ones for visitors than we have for media, but that basically, stipulates certain things that they agree to. So for example, if media come, they are agreeing that they need to get consent before they take photos of any of the kids or do interviews. They're not allowed to be alone with the children. There's, just these things are all outlined clearly before people come. I realize that this can be more difficult when you're working in public spaces, but at the same time, if you're running regular programming, you can be confident with yourself to go up to people that are shooting photos and just say, hey, if you want to, find out what they're taking photos for, and also ask them to get permission and come back another time. So another key area in a child protection policy is staff and volunteer recruitment. So, these are the people that are going to be working with the kids at your project every day. And you need to make sure that you're being as thorough as you can in terms of selecting these people. So the ideal situation for anyone that is working directly with the kids is that you're doing multiple interviews with them. You're doing background checks. So in a lot of countries, you're able to get a police check on anybody to find out if they have a criminal background. And you can always call references. You can look for people that have experience already with working with children. It can be very useful to find people that are willing to or able to commit to longer term with your project. So as I mentioned before, having a high turnover of teachers can actually be distressing for kids. So that can be a factor. And it's always best if anyone who's coming can speak the local language, because then they'll be able to, communicate with the kids that they're teaching, obviously. Now that we've talked about several different ideas related to child protection, I thought we could take a few minutes here where each of you could make a list of the risks to child safety in your skate program. So these could be actual risks that you see already around you, or it could be ones that maybe you hadn't thought about before, but are potential ones that could be emerging. So some areas to consider are physical environment. So what is the condition of the skate park? Is there any, sharp metal bits sticking out? Is the floor in okay condition? You can see in our middle photo there, we have some damage on the floor. And at this space, it was actually the rooftop of another nonprofit organization. And we had to build a fence all the way around so that boards wouldn't fly over, and a net around the mini ramps so boards wouldn't fly into the windows and stuff like that. So thinking about those kinds of things. Also staff and volunteers. So we just talked about recruitment. So what are potential risks that you see with the current model that you have in terms of getting people to help teaching the programs. Also visitors or spectators, so making sure that children are safe from any strangers that are in the area. You see on the photo in the bottom left that we were doing skate sessions in Kabul in a public fountain, so there was always people around watching. And it was important for us to make sure we had, enough of a teacher to student ratio to be able to keep our eyes on everybody and make sure that everyone was safe. Another example you'll see on the bottom right there is on Go Skateboarding Day, we go skate through the streets in the different locations that we are. And so, then you have to think of things like, do the kids have enough water? How are you managing the traffic? And, are you able to get like a police escort or something like that to keep the kids safe? So yeah, maybe pause this video for a few minutes and just jot down your ideas. And we'll come back to this risk list in a couple slides. So we're near the end of this presentation, and to kind of finish it off, I just thought I'd talk about a few more examples of best practices that are relevant for skate projects. So the first one is to always have 2 or more staff or volunteers present during any activities that you do with kids. I realize some of you have like really small projects and this is not something that's always possible, but it should be something you should aspire to, because especially if you're bringing in volunteers and you're letting them teach kids alone, this can be really dangerous if people have bad intentions that are coming into the project. You don't want to think that people do, but having more people there as supervisors or teachers can be really good. Secondly, all your staff and volunteers should be trained on how to act in the proper way with students. So I think this is a particular risk for skate projects, because often maybe there's not that big of an age difference between some of the participants you have and some of the volunteers, and you're all just skaters and you want to hang out, but at a certain point the teachers, the volunteers, they're also role models, and you have to make sure that they are not acting in a way that is inappropriate with the kids. Similarly, if your skate project is in a context where you have foreign staff or volunteers coming in to teach kids, it's very useful for them to get a cultural introduction either before or upon arrival, where they're made aware of what the expectations are in terms of how to act. For example, in some countries there can be issues with males and females interacting or making any physical contact, so just to be made aware of that. Also, I would highly recommend having a child protection policy, even if it is a short one. And, skate projects, they get a lot of media attention, so having a section on media visits and having some policies around that are really good. And also having a way to report incidents. So if something happens at your project, it can even be like an injury in the skate park, having a way to report that and file that. Some more skate-specific best practices. So, this is maybe a controversial one, but safety gear can be really helpful if you're working in communities where maybe skateboarding isn't super well known. Parents can be really worried about injuries. Safety gear can be a good way to kind of make people feel more comfortable with skateboarding. And helmets obviously protect your head from brain damage, so that's pretty useful. And skate park conditions, so we talked about like making sure there's not like rusty nails or things sticking out of the skate park. And also, ratio of the number of participants to teachers, to make sure it's not like hectic and kids colliding into each other. You can organize the skate park or the area for different skate abilities. So if you have a bunch of different kids and some are really good and some are beginners, like kind of maybe blocking off a section for the beginners to just like practice pushing and not be maybe getting in the way of others and causing potential injuries. And then lastly, a pretty obvious one is to have first aid supplies and, if possible, first aid training, at least for some of the key teachers. So you can look into if there's nonprofits in the area that will actually provide this training for free, because quite often there is. So what are next steps for building up your child protection at your skate project? Well, the first thing you can do is take the quiz. How safe is your project? So there's a link coming up here on the video. You can click that, and this will just give you a bit of an idea of where your strengths are already and where you have potential weaknesses. And then secondly, highly recommended to create or update your child protection policy. So that risk list that we made earlier, that can be really useful as a starting point for thinking about what you want to have covered in there. And we also, on the Goodpush Toolkit, on the actual page for child protection, if you go down to the bottom with the resources and templates, you will find a child protection policy template, which you are free to use and adapt and just make it your own. Thanks for watching the Goodpush video presentation on child protection. If you do draft a child protection policy and would like some feedback, feel free to get in touch with us. Good luck!